Fortunately, we're only this well known because things have gotten so much worse, and that is heartbreaking. But FIRE, we defend people all over the political spectrum. It would be so much easier for us to raise money if we didn't. Like, basically, if we only defended people on the left or people on the right, then yeah, that's $100 million idea, within a couple of years. But we go the harder road, which is defending everybody, because we want to be one of the institutions that all Americans can still trust.
Welcome back to
Ami's house.
Very, very pleased to be here with someone we met a few weeks ago at the Dissident Dialogues conference we talked about on the podcast. The founder of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Not the founder.
I am not the founder.
Oh, well, I screwed up my intro. There you go.
Who are you again?
Yes. Okay, well, we're going to talk about
Greg Lukianoff. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, Greg Lukianoff, welcome to the show. I know we're all about free speech. I messed up my actual speech, but that's okay.
Hey, wait, so what's the foundation called, though, for anyone listening?
The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, which
I joined about a year and a half in, and I was the first legal director of FIRE, and I became president. Yep.
You put it on the map, Greg. Let's be honest.
Why, thank you. I can't take sole credit for that. That's my incredible team.
Yeah, actually, so in my intellectual and political evolution, I remember seeing you in the early days of this whole free speech, like on Stossel.
Yeah.
And back in the days when things made a little more sense.
Yeah.
About this whole conversation, just the political divide was a little cleaner, and it was starting to happen on campus. I remember where the people complaining were comedians and people who were going to campuses and couldn't make jokes, and kids were starting to get very, very sensitive to ideas that just made them uncomfortable, or even humor that made them uncomfortable, different things that they were coming up against. So I wanted to just ask you about just the origin story of when you got involved in FIRE and what the pulse and temperature was on campus at the time. That you were tapping into, and also about how you were involved in the coddling of the American mind, that environment in which you were writing that book.
Yeah.
What we were looking at then,
yep.
In terms of the temperature on campus and the pulse and culture of students on campus.
So I have to take you back to 1873. Actually, the 1980s.
You look amazing for your age.
Thank you. Growing up, first generation American, Russian American, growing up around a lot of other immigrant kids. I feel lucky to, be a Gen Xer because we generally have a pretty good appreciation of freedom of speech. And a lot of the kids I grew up with, to be left of center largely meant to be pro freedom of speech. Those things were considered kind of synonymous. And by the time I got to college, and particularly law school, there was this idea of political correctness, and it was here and there. Definitely less of it at American University, my undergrad university, and more of it at Stanford, my law school. And it was annoying, but it seemed like it was like an embarrassing thing that had been intense a couple of years ago and had kind of faded. I was a little bit disabused of this idea, though, when I worked at the ACLU of Northern California back in 1999. And it was in my most recent book, Canceling of the American Mind. I talk about how, we weren't the First Amendment people weren't the cool kids at the ACLU by 1999, at least the one of Northern California. And I started to put together, given the attitudes of a lot of my classmates, who all went to fancy schools, or most of them did, that there was kind of a movement against freedom of speech in sort of elite circles, that essentially, once it had been seen as the defining characteristic of being a liberal, it was starting to push in the other direction. So when I started at FIRE in 2001, I was surprised. I was already surprised it was easier to get in trouble for what you said on a college campus than I expected. And my first book, Unlearning Liberty, which came out in 2012, I talked about a lot of the worst cases I'd seen before, and there are a lot of outrageous ones prior to 2012. But wow, things changed around 2013, 2014. The first cohort of students that in my career were really bad on freedom of speech started showing up on campus in large numbers, and they joined forces with the already really bad administrative apparatus on campus. And everything just started to get rapidly worse. 2014 was also when I approached John Haidt about writing Coddling of the American Mind, the original article, and there's a backstory there too, which I can talk about. But as far as the free speech stuff, like the 2014, there was a clear shift, and suddenly students were demanding speech codes and disinvitations and all this nonsense. But the thing that really it really went off the rails in 2017, and large numbers of students signing emails, demanding. Signing petitions demanding that their professors be fired was nothing like I'd ever seen. And then 2020, 2021, one of the major points of canceling the American mind is how this is all happening on a historically unprecedented scale.
And exponentially, meaning they keep one-upping themselves on a new low of just when we think they can't take it. Like I remember the Brett Weinstein era, there were the incidents of virality of clips going around of students at Yale claiming to be oppressed surrounding a teacher screaming because of a Halloween costume. I remember.
Do you know who took that video?
You?
Yep.
Ah, okay. Well, no video cred. That's not cool. But yes. Oh my God. So you were right there, right in the thick of it.
I was right there. I had been.
you see that clip,
and of
Michael?
course, it turned into a
No,
conspiracy theory at Yale.
Oh, I mean, these kids were
Lukianoff doing there.
Yeah.
Well, it perfectly tracks Trump's rise. Also, 2014 is when he announced, right? And then 2017 was his first year. Some people just went nuts.
At 2015 was when he still seemed kind of like this isn't going to happen,
Right?
And yeah, but
Like, he is
2017, as
Hitler,
far as like
was-
the real blowups on campus, a lot of them were justified as being because Trump was in office.
Right.
And I mean, how do you track that? Do you think there's a correlation there between two questions? Is like the anxious generation that Haidt's new book that he's talking about of these kids who are hyper anxious in general, but also the administrators. How are they complicit in this, especially when the idea of being a professor and administrator on campus, it's not advantageous to you for kids not to process any novel ideas, you would think, unless you just enjoy this sort of paternal control that you can make these kids look up to you in some sort of way to feel powerful. And yet it's going to come back to bite you the second you say the wrong thing too. So for the professors and administrators that come from a previous generation, how do you explain them complicit in these kids coming in, not able to handle ideas and not helping to mold them into people who can?
Well, that it was a long time coming, and there was sort of a sense that, and this is one of the things I find so outrageous about what we're doing to younger people and what we've done to them, is that I think there was a sense in even back at Stanford in the late 90s that essentially, even if it wasn't entirely true, if you could make people feel guilty and shameful enough, it would motivate them towards good action. Like somehow that would be the secret sauce to saving the world, more or less, is make people feel terrible about themselves. And so I think that was always a very thin idea, like a very kind of like shallow way of looking at the world. But I do think that the idea that kind of like, making people miserable towards a better world, it was kind of taken for granted to a degree. And so my whole work on coddling the American mind came from my own suicidal depression in 2007 in the great city of Philadelphia. And as I was recovering from that, and to be clear, a lot of that had to do with being stuck in the culture war all the time, because it's exhausting. And particularly like now, one of the nice things about dissident dialogues is I got to be around all these other people who have had people try to cut their heads off or ruin their careers or hate their guts because they, stood up against ideology. There wasn't a community like that back then. And so I was very isolated. I got very depressed and suicidal, as I said. But as I was recovering, I was doing cognitive behavioral therapy. And the whole idea of cognitive behavioral therapy is to look at the mental exaggerations you have in your head, and they list them in CBT. Things like overgeneralization, things like black and white thinking, things like catastrophizing. And I was recovering from this, learning these mental habits, ways to not make yourself anxious and depressed, which, by the way, saved my life and fundamentally changed my life. And I was looking at them and then looking at what was going on campus, and it was kind of like, it seems like the adults in the room are saying, do catastrophize, do overgeneralize, do engage in binary thinking, do blame, do discount positives, all these things that will make you miserable. But at least in 2008, I was like, well, good thing, the millennials aren't buying this. That they're not suckers for this stuff. They're rolling their eyes at the adults like they always have. That all changed in 2014. And suddenly you could tell that there was a crop of students who believed this stuff absolutely to their core. They believed that it was essentially moral to catastrophize, to engage in binary thinking, overgeneralization, all these things. And the thing that we saw earlier than most, me and Haidt, was just that, wow, this is going to be a disaster, not just for academic freedom and for freedom of speech, not just on campus, but eventually off. This is going to be a disaster for those poor kids' mental health.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there as far as what you said about, I wanted to tie it into how we now arrive at the state of these kids on campus given in a post-October 7th world. You said something really interesting about, I just wonder if at first, like the fact that they're leading to having mental health struggles to begin with, does this feeling of catastrophizing give them a certain validity to their already predisposed anxiety coming in? In other words, it's very tempting to believe that the world is coming, that the terrible things are happening when they're not necessarily happening, or given to some sort of derangement because it gives validity to a sense of anxiety and loneliness they already have. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is I'm now struggling with this idea because I was very averse to the catastrophizing, and have been for many years, the catastrophizing of the left, because I always see it as ways to just get more power. We saw it during COVID. We see it in the way they try to pass things about climate and environmental policy. And at the same time, I've become a catastrophist when it comes to looking at the protests on campus and across the world in a post-October 7th world where people are supporting the slaughter of Jews and supporting terrorism. So I know this is a big, multifaceted question, but how do we get from kids who on campus who can't take a joke and have trouble with that to now proudly supporting terrorism? And then that makes me have my own sense of catastrophism that I may be buying into, but now I sort of say, wait, I never thought this could happen. I never thought I'd see this coming.
There's actually a bunch of different answers to that. And one of them is that a lot of it was tactical. So some of it was, I think if you talk to the individual students, who believe that that they needed trigger warnings and that everyone needed to be hypersensitive, and that saying that I believe the most qualified person should get the job is a painful, evil microaggression, is that they sincerely believe, in many of the cases, they sincerely believe those things. Mm-hmm. But partially because, but it also ends up being because the atmosphere on campus is so left-leaning. And since the student body has become more left-leaning too, but that's not a surprise because a lot of the way you actually, the essays that you're expected to write are more or less, prove you're an activist. And they don't mean a right-wing activist. They mean, a acceptable activist. Mm-hmm. So I think that I think that the part of it was it's so insulated from itself, they can't really tell that a lot of these are rationalizations for the opinions they wanted in the first place, mm-hmm. Which is something easier to be disabused of when you have people you disagree with in the room, being kind of like, hey, that sounds stupid to me. That's a very healthy environment, particularly to have in a knowledge-producing institution. And the fact that it doesn't exist in many departments at all is deeply unhealthy. But when it comes to the move over into people saying, oh, yeah, from the river to the sea, and really being kind of like, we want the Jews. When they chant the more recent chant, which is kind of like an old chant, but like hearing students actually say it, is that we want all of it. Mm-hmm. Like we don't want a two-state solution. We want all of it. Mm-hmm. That makes sense in terms of intersectionality. That essentially, so intersectionality, and in Coddling the American Mind, we were, somewhat kind of like, okay, like at a theoretical level, we are an intersection of our identities. And I always liked, I can't remember who coined this, but basically saying that to a degree, kind of like you're so much the intersection of your identities that we're all individuals, like essentially like in a sense that all gets you back to individuality. Mm-hmm. But that's not the way intersectionality was really intended. It was supposed to be a sort of way of analyzing who's powerful and who's not. And if you have too many intersecting negative or oppressed identities, then you're even more oppressed than someone who has fewer of them. And as we pointed out in Coddling, there's no way for this to not have a moral valence, that essentially it turns into this incredibly oversimplified anti-intellectual idea of good versus evil. that essentially there are the universe is pretty clearly split into good oppressed and bad oppressors.
And all based on immutable identity, not based on ideas or character. It's all based on things you don't really even choose for yourself. We've just artificially tapped onto these things, the characteristics of who's deserving of virtue, based pretty much on identities that are immutable.
Largely, but mostly that's based on immutable identity. But once you have this simplistic, hyper-simplistic, and again, anti-intellectual way of looking at the world, then yeah, like people get in this kind of like it's good versus evil, man. Like I think, and they're using in some cases, you know, I'm going to credit the kids. They're using their sometimes high IQs to actually justify the accuracy of their existing oversimplified worldview. So it leads to people, you know, believing that that you should be kind about fat phobia and you should use people's pronouns, and it's the worst violence you can commit to somebody if you don't. And also, it's Hamas didn't actually rape anybody. You know, they're actually basically peace-loving freedom fighters because they have this, again, oversimplified mindset.
And you described it as tactical. Is there like a movement or a small group of academics who had this end in mind? I mean, that sounds very conspiracy theory when I say that, but what do you mean by tactical?
It's basically the nature of and you're pretty quiet, by the way. The nature of sort of Marcusean politics. So Herbert Marcuse was you know, he gets blamed for a lot, but he should be, because he really kind of painted a very clear picture of the way he wanted Marxism to sort of save itself from the disappointment of the proletariat. Mm-hmm. And what I mean there is kind of like, so Herbert Marcuse was considered the guru of the new left in the 1960s. He wrote a book called One Dimensional Man, which people think is some kind of achievement. It's a hyper simplistic way of looking at the world, and just, you know, it's like barely warmed over Marxism, saying, oh, you know, consumers, who cares? And he wrote this thing called oppressive tolerance, which people also credit as being somehow deep. And it's like, no, it's actually a simpleton's idea that essentially I am part of good people like Marxists. America bad. We should have free speech. They should not. So we need mass power over the regressive. And he's very explicit. He means conservatives. He means the so-called right wing. Mm-hmm. And he's very clear about this. And, you know, but it's also just kind of like, congratulations, dude. Like, like that's the oldest justification for tyranny in the books, is that basically my people are good and the other people are bad. Swell. Mm-hmm. You know, bravo. Like, anyway, sorry. I don't bother hiding my contempt for this.
So you recommend this book? It's on your list of recommended reads.
Oh, I do. I recommend it because it's so direct. Yeah. Like, right. It's so simple. Like, it's just kind of like, oh, okay. That's
at least he's honest about it, right?
Yeah. And so one of the ways that Marcuse sort of changed the Marxist left was to be really explicit about, well, the proletariat seemed to actually like, you know, they thought labor unions were pretty good and they liked a better standard of living, and they didn't seem as enthralled with the intellectuals as the intellectuals really wanted or expected them to be. Mm-hmm. And no kidding. And so it was a reconceptualizing of the Marxist left around the idea that you had the intellectuals, and then you, rather than the proletariat, and this is Herbert Marcuse's very sensitive words, they're not mine, that one place you could look is for ghetto populations in order to be kind of like part of this new coalition. So this was an explicitly elitist movement, basically, right. Like college students should rule the world in combination with the oppressed. And a lot of this, you know, like was reflected in the development of critical theory and all this kind of stuff. So the idea that, to a degree, all of these decisions are tactical. Yeah. I mean, like, basically the idea is like, we're the intellectuals, doesn't matter if we're white or rich kids, which oftentimes they are rich kids. We're the representative of the regular folk, and we need extra powers in order to make America and make the rest of the world more just.
Right. And you can trace this back to sort of the Platonic idea of like philosopher kings we are
Yes.
the ones, the intellectuals in society, the way they view themselves in general, view themselves as ways to bestow the better wisdom. And the proletariat can be part of it, but we are the ones who dictate it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I gave a talk called Fight the Guardians, because basically my idea was like Plato's guardian. Basically, people who think they're part of Plato's guardian class are people who you should never, ever listen to.
And it's interesting because the academy is the last place these people are sort of looked to have any real authority over anything.
Yeah.
Because outside of academia, I think there's a bitterness there where they're not the ones necessarily making the most money or having the most influence, but in the microcosm of the university, they're the top. So a lot of times these students, what I'm looking at is they get to college and all of a sudden they're told by the quote adults in the room that the script is actually flipped. You thought the whole time America was the good guy or Israel was the good guy. Plot thickens. Here's the twist. And there's something for kids who are developing and actually do want to play with new ideas. It sort of taps into this, I think, this notion that, hey, if the adults in the room, even if you and I can discuss it and know a little bit better about where this is coming from, it seems like these are legitimate because I'm looking to my teachers, and this is the last dynamic that exists in which the student is looking at the teacher with something that they may not know. Yeah. Like they may have they may know something I don't, and it's appealing to say maybe I can reverse everything I've known, and maybe speech is violence and violence is speech. It's just this weird. And when we spoke to Scott Galloway about it on the podcast, he talked about like there's a healthy amount of experimentation with ideas that we do want, but if the administrators are using perversions to do that, I think you get a result like this where kids are wanting to be virtuous and wanting to be on the right side of history, but they're playing with a completely backwards presentation that when we say tactical, or when you describe as tactical, it's that these ideas have long intellectual roots that are animating like most of the professors on campus.
Yeah, and they're the worst thing in my opinion. Their ideology, and I feel like an ideology, like my joke about it is, ideology is our society's way of turning IQ points against themselves. And I feel like that was the great lesson of the 20th century was the danger of, and there's a quote from I think Crime and Punishment. It basically, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's more or less you're working really hard to give up your duty to think, to absolve yourself of your duty to think. You're coming up with some simplified vision of the world, some meaning of life in 10 words or less that you can always refer back to, that gets rid of all of the complexity of life.
Right.
And if you have a simple idea that all history is class struggle, well, congratulations, you just oversimplified the world terribly, and you're maybe. And that's one of this is the question, whether or not the real ideologues, are they using their smartness, in order to undermine themselves, or were they always midwits who can only kind of understand that basically there's only two settings, for the world, oppressor or oppressed. But it can be a comforting way to look at the world. Humanity has a tendency to like dualism. But it sure isn't the way the world actually works.
Well, my question then is, how do you draw a distinction between oversimplified thinking and morally clear thinking? Because when you talk about good and evil, there's a part of me that feels compelled. I've been like post October 7th when I saw this insane amount of confusion and a co-opting of the language around the issue of the Middle East, and seeing people not look at footage of October 7th and not be able to tell who the good guys and the bad guys are in a way. There was a part of me that felt compelled to draw clear lines that this is a battle of barbarism versus civilization. Sam Harris has talked about the reason I'm siding with Israel in this scenario is not because I feel a tribal allegiance to Israel as someone who's Jewish or anything like that. We're talking about humanity versus cruelty, civilization and barbarism. And there's just a clear moral difference between, in this case, Israel and its enemies. So I do think sometimes being morally clear on good and evil is helpful.
I think you should be careful about that, because you have to understand the people who believe that we don't want two-state solution, we want all of it. They could not be more morally clear. And moral clarity for a personality like me and for a civil libertarian, moral clarity actually kind of scares us. And it's not that you can't draw distinctions. Of course you can draw distinctions. I actually thought Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, pointed out like how difficult it is to draw moral distinctions when you don't believe in free will. But But when it comes to it, kind of like, yeah, I think you can make the argument that it's clear that one side is more evil than the other. But moral clarity is also something. There's a wonderful quote from and I recommend this to everybody. There's a speech called "The Spirit of Liberty" by Learned Hand, which came out in 1944, which was trying to explain what was so different about small L liberalism. And he said, "The true spirit of liberty is that which is not too sure that it is right."
Right. I guess I take that with the grain of salt that we're really always talking about matters of degree and not absolutes. No one can have an absolute sense of purely being 100% absolved of any wrongdoing. It's just that I find that sometimes when you're you risk when you're looking at things too critically to not draw those distinctions and say, I've seen the debates online. Well, America's a terrorist government too.
Yeah.
And you're just like, look, we've done bad things. A lot of people have done bad things. There are people who would jaywalk, and there are people who are serial killers. Both are technically criminals. But let's be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and drawing distinctions. But I hear what you're saying about not having absolute moral certainty because they do too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I guess it's just challenging in a time when you see such a perversion of when something should seem so obvious.
Keep in mind, it came from ideologues with absolute moral certainty.
Right. I mean, all the worst crimes of the 20th century thought that the worst evils are committed by people thinking they're doing great work.
I think they're saving the world. That was actually a very funny moment in my early friendship with Jonathan Haidt. It was just realizing how similar we thought. We were actually at a party in New York, and someone was kind of going off on how, historically the most dangerous people are greedy people. And both Haidt and I kind of like made a face at each other, didn't even know each other very well. It's like, no. The most dangerous people are the people who are absolutely dead certain they are saving the world, probably from you.
Right. I think it was Milton Friedman or Hayek who said something similar, like, beware of the person who comes to you saying, I'm going to do good for you. I'm here.
I speak for the people. It is the one that you really like. You should check out the talk, because one of the things where I was warning people about the danger of someone who claims to speak for the people, and just making the point, I'm a First Amendment free speech defender, and that my idea is, well, why don't you let the people talk for themselves? They can speak for themselves. But of course, in ideology, you end up with ideas like false consciousness that essentially it requires actual intellectuals to understand what you really want and need. And you might have some illusion that you're comfortable, but really that's just false consciousness because you don't really know what you need or want.
And they think they know better. And that combined with any kind of state power or the ability to make decisions for you is where the real recipe for disaster comes in, because intellectuals can have ideas all day long and make recommendations, but so long as, but there seems to be always this temptation to use policy to do something and not a pen or ideas, which is interesting. I was just on a flight with Jonathan Haidt, and I wanted to touch base with him, but he was on his phone the whole time. So you know what? I was like, well, hey, I mean, look, he's not 14, so I gave him a pass. But hey, next time. On the subject, you've talked about how on the subject of free speech in general, just to get into the weeds of, at a time where you were fighting the good fight on free speech on campus, Scott Galloway said something about how free speech seems to be at its freest when it comes to anti-Semitism, at least in its current day, where people are saying, well, now it's free speech, where the utter inconsistency of how that's been applied on the culture of college campuses.
Massive double standards,
It's kind of insane. But I did want to take it from the campus to the street. I recently visited the Nova exhibit. And then literally that day, an hour later, the whole place erupted in a protest led by really, really despicable people protesting a commemorative exhibit about people who were massacred.
And raped.
And
but they think that part's a hoax.
No, either they say it didn't happen or they're glad it did happen. So I'm just like, pick one. They're saying it. They're saying it's propaganda, used an atrocity propaganda. This is Zionist propaganda, and yet resistance by any means necessary. So talk about holding contradictory ideas in your head. Thanks a lot, Marcuse. But I guess the limits of free speech, I know you've been asked this a lot, and I always, this conversation about which phrasing constitutes a threat. You can't threaten individuals, public versus private space. If you could speak a little to where you draw these distinctions as, I guess, a free speech absolutist, if you consider yourself one, in what sense can we have this conversation now that we could talk about free speech all day long in a context 10 years ago when we want to just have ideas that are freely discussed on campus. But now when we're talking about violence or support of terrorism, safety, senses of safety being violated for students, like where does free speech come into play?
Well, to be clear, 10 years ago, all these issues were still around. They just weren't quite as intense.
Maybe 20 years ago. I mean,
20 years ago, they were around too. You always have to remind people like how much darker the past actually is than they remember.
Sure. Fair enough.
I think about the Oklahoma City bombing, for example, like one of those things that's kind of like, there was a domestic terrorism. It was terrifying.
But were there protests on campus supporting Oklahoma City?
that is a good point. Not to my knowledge.
What was his name? McKay?
Timothy
McVeigh. He was a resistance fighter. Timothy McVeigh was supporting resistance against whatever. Osama bin Laden, I'm sure, felt like he was supporting a resistance movement too.
There were and 9/11. There were absolutely people on campus who said he's totally right. We totally had it coming, and because I started right around 9/11. Believe me, there were a lot of students and professors.
So maybe there's the beginning of it. The sort of
and the reason why they weren't going McVeigh was right was because McVeigh was a right wing terrorist. But when they perceived of
interesting
of the 9/11 attackers as being freedom fighters, there was a lot of people saying, "Oh, these guys are right," including many people that Fire defended.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you've made it this far, we want to let you know that Ami's House is now on Patreon. We love doing extra content, bonus footage with every episode. The best way to support us is to head on over to Patreon, become a guest, and support the show for $5 a month.
If you like watching Ami cut me off, Patreon is
Patreon.com/Ami's House for bonus content. Thanks so much for your support and become a guest.
So what are the parameters? Like what is protected and what isn't? First of all, there's no such thing as a free speech absolutist, at least not among like any serious person. I am an opinion absolutist, that essentially whatever opinion you have is worth knowing. And here's the thing that really gets missed here. If you are shouting out that I am a horrible anti-Semite who believes that nobody was, raped in the October 7th attacks, it is good information to have about that. It is good to know that people actually think that. You are not safer for being like, if we were magically to shut up like all of these activists tomorrow, you would be less safe for not knowing like how serious this movement has become. So, and this is the way I put it, is that, if the project of human knowledge is to know the world as it is, it's literally impossible to know the world as it is without knowing what people really think. And that's not true even if it's bad. It's true, especially if it's concerning, especially if it's something that's dangerous. And that's one of the reasons why I think Europe has this kind of, is more of a powder keg than people really quite get, is that they do rely on censorship to kind of keep social peace. And that's not going to work over time. But anyway, so I think the First Amendment does a really good job of actually having sensible exceptions to freedom of speech that are cabined to narrow categories. So it can't turn into this balancing test thing that Europe does, for example, or that, some of the thinkers on the left, like Stanley Fish, want us to do. That essentially we should just be, every time, there's offensive speech, we go kind of like, well, on this hand, and guess what happens when you have a balancing test? Power always justifies its own way. So having the categorical approach is smart. So threats aren't protected. Like something that would actually make a reasonable person think that they are in fear of bodily harm or death are not protected, nor should they be. Discriminatory harassment is not protected, and that's severe, persistent, and pervasive discrimination against a person or group on the basis of a protected characteristic. Definitely, I've seen that thrown around like crazy on campus for stuff that is clearly just mildly offensive speech. But definitely in the last 6 months, I've seen incidences where it's like, no, that if that Jewish student wants to say they were harassed, they were totally freaking harassed. They're also threatened. I've seen a lot of assault going on a lot of these things.
But is this against in terms of the language, just to clarify, is it against individuals, or are we talking about even groups? If someone wants to say the Jews or this person when you're making a threat? You know,
If you're saying it has to be against either, like, it has to be against real people. It can't just be like, in my opinion, all these people should be killed.
Yeah.
Like it or not, that's protected speech. But again, also useful information to know that this person thinks you should all be killed. And that's one of the things that I thought was so short-sighted of the like during the anti-Semitism hearings back in December, of going after the idea of like calls for genocide, as if that was going to protect Jewish students on campus, saying that, but you must draw the line at calls for genocide. I'm like, okay, rocket scientist, do you know how quick this is going to be co-opted by the side you think you're against? And it has been completely co-opted, because what's the argument from the pro-Palestinians? Is that Israel is committing a genocide? And so it's very predictable, like the way these things, like the tool that you think is actually going to help you when it comes to censorship, when it comes to control of speech, ends up getting used against you 9 times out of 10.
Right, but I will say, I think in the case of the hearings, one of the motivations was one, pointing out what's actually happening on campus.
Yeah.
Like, are these calls happening? Not what to do about it, and if they are, if you're not doing anything about it, then you're incredible hypocrites for having one standard for other races and not another standard for Jews. And I think that was helpful to know too, right?
The double standards are off the charts. And as far as like the thing that gave me no sympathy for the university presidents who showed up that day, maybe a little bit for the MIT president, because MIT just has not been as bad as Penn or Harvard. And just to give you an impression of
they
how
just want to build stuff. Yeah,
Penn and Harvard are. We do a annual ranking of schools according to their commitment to freedom of speech. It's the largest survey of opinion ever done. Of the environment for free speech on given campuses. We also have the largest database of professor cancellations, student cancellations, deplatforming, and speech codes ever put together. We triangulate them all. We weigh them to different degrees. We've been perfecting over the years. And Harvard finished dead last.
Wow.
Earlier this year. Penn finished second to last.
Wow.
I mean, Harvard actually got a negative score, the first negative score we've ever had in our history, because they had so few pluses and so many minuses. They actually
Where's
had
Columbia?
What's that?
Where's Columbia on that list? I feel like
Columbia does not do well, and I have a feeling they're going to do even worse this year. But Penn and Harvard dead last.
Yeah.
And so when they showed up on that hearing, it was already kind of too late, because nobody would take them seriously. And the idea that they tried to show up as if they were suddenly, unapologetic defenders of freedom of speech, even if it's highly offensive, please. And no, so it was a boy who cried wolf kind of situation. They weren't going to take them seriously.
Yeah.
What was it like for you to watch that? Were you just like, was your blood boiling?
I thought I didn't actually watch. I watched it in snippets. I thought they handled it really badly. I thought they got really bad advice. I thought that they should have said anti-Semitism is a problem on campus. Like, come out and said that. Of course, they always want to say that they like so many of they want to say Islamophobia is a problem too. And like it's just like it's so predictable, like what they're going to say.
Right.
So I felt like, but I will say this. When they said that when it comes to what speech isn't protected, they were right saying that context matters, because there's and you don't want it to be the case that any statement, even if you say it and you're kidding, even if you say it, flippantly, even if you just write it on a piece of paper, is not protected. There has to be more. It can't just be an opinion. It can't just be a statement. It can't just be a chant. And so there was a lot of people asking, so you're saying calls for genocide are unprotected, or you're saying calls for genocide are protected. I'm like, well, let's take a beat and point out what they're actually pointing to. They're pointing to Intifada, and they're pointing to from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I think that once you get people back there, it's kind of like by themselves, you understand these are protected speech. And I definitely understand that Jewish students, when they hear that, they hear potentially, threatening or even genocidal intentions behind them. I find it deeply offensive when people say that. But I think for a lot of these student activists, when they say Intifada, they think they're saying resist. And there was a Wall Street Journal journalist who took some of the students who were chanting from the river to the sea and pointed out, here's the river, here's the C. They didn't even know that basically
Right.
like that was the whole.
So
that was the
intent
whole
matters
thing.
too as to what they actually think they're saying. But you're just saying under these, assuming all these standards are applied equally, you would
Yeah.
say all this stuff should be permitted so we know what people are thinking
Yeah.
and expressing.
But I did want to be clear about this one thing. Can chants of intifada with in certain contexts again, or can from the river to the sea, like when you're surrounding somebody, when you're targeting Jewish students, they all can be unprotected if there's additional actions connected to them.
Interesting.
And
Or if
that's
you
one of the things that they actually should have said as well. But they didn't know enough about freedom of speech or academic freedom to make a persuasive argument for it. They just looked flippant.
Or standing in front of students holding an Israeli flag and saying, Al-Qassam, here's your next target. Someone held a sign that said that. Now, that feels pretty direct and threatening. I don't know. But I guess it does get complicated into the weeds. Like you're saying, when things translate into action, they sort of tried to say that during the hearings, when it directly translates into action or assault or harassment. It can step very – it really toes the line from this is protected to this is no longer protected. And I think that's what we were seeing.
Yeah, I'm following the thought of it's better to know what people think, especially if it's nasty. I've been following the Candace Owens, Brandon Joy Gray thing pretty closely because I'm really interested in it from the perspective of they seem to have a pulse on what people want to hear. Yeah, and they're kind of delivering it. Ami has some different thoughts on that.
What is? I've been intentionally avoiding what Candace Owens says. What is she saying now?
Ami, what's she saying now?
Well, her and I actually had a conversation a few months back about, as the tension at the Daily Wire was building when she was being not only, I would say, critical of or suspicious of what's going on in Israel and critical of Israel. I think there were, inadvertent or advertent, depending on how you look at it, dabbling in anti-Semitic tropes that were happening and tension that was going on at the Daily Wire. There was a whole drama at the Daily Wire, and it was a combination of, it started with the whole Kanye West fiasco where she sort of tried to defend him and fumbled the ball on that, which she admitted to. And then the Israel thing happened, and rather than having sympathy and solidarity with what Israel had been going through, depending on what you think her motivations are, there was provocative statements made and also suspicion about what's really going on here, and kind of motivating her audience to think a little more conspiratorial about like suspicion around Israel and Israel. She just did an episode with Brianna, and the whole opening was, is Israel controlling us? Are we being controlled by Israel? And meanwhile, Brianna Joy Gray on the other side of it, on the far left side, has just been really outwardly, dismissing of Jewish suffering very explicitly and really despicable. Yeah. And I sort of made distinctions between those who know better and have an agenda versus those who are kind of shooting from the hip. And I put Candace in sort of that latter category. But it's all kind of complicated now in a sense that having talked to her, because I've had a one-on-one discussion with her, I was sort of clued into most of her positions, I think, are rooted in a lack of awareness or an ignorance to really what's going on, or the history of anti-Semitism, the history of the conflict. So she's responding to pressure, and therefore coming from the sort of conservative commentary side of things, the area that's being delicate now to talk about is anti-Semitism and the Jewish community in Israel. So when she feels a pressure, she just kind of goes for the opposite direction to be provocative because she feels that pressure. And I think that's the instinct she's responding to. I think Brianna Joy Gray is coming from a darker place. But anyway, they recently had the conversation, and you brought them up because...
Well, so they're claiming that their free speech is being violated, right, or there's certain things you're allowed to talk about, and there's certain things you aren't allowed to talk about. Yeah. And then we talk about there's a difference between you're not working for a public institution, you're working for a private company. Yeah. So they can do whatever they want to.
Yeah, when it comes to Brianna, so in Canceling the American Mind, our definition of cancel culture was the uptick of campaigns starting around 2014 to get people fired, expelled, otherwise punished for speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. And by that, we mean an analogy to public employee law. So I did, it gave me a little bit of pause when Brianna was fired. And it's like, and asking, would this count as cancel culture? And I know that Robbie Suave, her co-host, who's a libertarian and a friend, definitely kind of thinks it was primarily about her opinion. But when it comes to, thinking it through and knowing more about the other justifications that they easily had for firing her. Because I mean, I did her show before. I did it with Robbie, and it was kind of embarrassing for her that she
Go on.
that what
Go on.
oh
Yeah, I did a show too.
that she just would rant, at rather than do an interview, she just kind of rant at people.
Well, Greg, right? I mean, we all know, right, that you're wrong, right, and I'm right, right? I mean, we all
Yeah.
know that, right? Because we all know, right?
And I got some kind of funny points for towards the end when she did a little speech. She's like, "Can you comment?" And I was just like, "No, but that was just a speech." And then she immediately like shut down the interview. And it's like,
Yeah.
"No, I'm sorry, Bree." Like,
So I think what we're trying to say is that there's a difference between legal consequences of speech and
Yeah.
any consequences of speech. And people like to throw out these terms like free speech, free speech. I want free speech. And we're talking about like there's just to do some housekeeping, the definition of free speech on the governmental level, censoring speech,
Yeah.
that's the legal consequences of speech that we all protect. And then there's any consequences, social,
Yeah.
or like you go up to your boss and you call him an asshole, you're going to get fired. You can't say free speech. But I also get the concern about cancel culture and not wanting to create a society that is willing to, cancel people for
basically,
opinions.
the concern is even when you're talking about private employers, because the First Amendment only applies to public employers.
Yes.
There's a little nuance there, but anyway, it only applies to public employers. And one of the points that we are making in Canceling the American Mind is that, you can evaluate, though, if someone gets fired, like, would a public employee have gotten fired for this? I think is a good way to do it. It also introduces a tremendous amount of nuance and common sense into it. So for the example of telling your boss to go fuck himself, well, yeah, you can fire a public employee for that. That's pretty clear cut. But you always have to remind people, and it started to look this way in 2020 and 2021, that it almost started to look like we're living in a society that if you disagreed with your employer, you could expect to be fired, even on political matters. And it's kind of like, okay, so that basically means you can have a job or a opinion, and and so you should be concerned about this happening on a systemic level. Now, when it comes to Brianna, the question is, would her behavior gotten a public employee fired? And I definitely, having heard more of the even crazier stuff that she said, like basically like saying that what did she say? Something
At Dissident Dialogue, she said Hamas wants to basically just establish she had some crazy ideas, but she also rolled her eyes at a hostage on her show. She had the sister of a hostage who did call her out directly by saying, I'm asking you to please believe women who said they were hurt from the events of October 7th or who come back from being taken hostage and don't dismiss them. She was calling her out, and Brianna just rolls her eyes and shuts down the show, and then proceeds to, and earlier in the episode, in this interview with this person, rather than just having sympathy and hearing her story, is trying to fact check her as if she's having a political debate with the sister of a hostage. And then she's all over Twitter. Barry Weiss is posting a video or a picture of her hiding from rocket fire, and she goes, "How's the airport in Gaza?" Meaning there's no ounce of humanity or anything for Jewish suffering. She's been denying October 7th massacres and atrocities, calling Hamas resistance movements, just engaged in some of the worst stuff. So and then when people disagree with her, she calls them racist, or she tries to shame them online. Oh, typical Zionist behavior, who can't, and she's the one who can't take the argument.
But I think the firing came, with the eye roll. It wasn't so much her opinion as it was the way she treated someone on her show. That's the way I read it.
Yeah. No, I definitely think that whether or not that counts as cancel culture, I'm leaning more towards, no, I think they probably had a justification to fire her at this point. But you want to be consistent, essentially, like even if someone whose opinion, like it's pretty clear I don't particularly like her or respect her, but even her, like if that was the reason, but it sounds like they had a million other justifications. I mean, like one of her speculations was essentially that October 7th was an inside job.
Yeah, the Hannibal Directive and all this stuff. Anything
The
she can
what?
do, she called it that.
I haven't heard that. What's that?
There's this report. She's always like, there's this report that there's something called the Hannibal Directive in which Israel was directed its army to fire upon its own citizens. I mean, anything she can do to lift agency and responsibility and accountability on the terrorists that proudly committed these atrocities, she'll do. She'll never talk about, even she snuck things past Candace. In her interview with her, she was like, all of a sudden, like, oh, and I do feel sympathy for the hostages, which is why I think Netanyahu should absolutely accept a ceasefire deal. I'm like, whoa. But if he doesn't, they should keep the hostages. Effectively, that's what you're saying. And she tries to be very sneaky and sleight of hand with it. Absolutely, Netanyahu shouldn't have bolstered up Hamas. But Hamas was the one that committed the atrocity. You don't say anything about it. So she effectively supports what Hamas did and supports Hamas keeping hostages unless they get the deal we want, not returning them unconditionally. So there's a real sleight of hand that goes on there with her that she gets past people, especially when she's talking to people. I think in Candace's case, I'm not making an excuse for Candace, who kind of doubled down on defending her, because I think she just saw a similar narrative.
Yeah.
Hey, you got fired for opinions and I got fired for opinions. Let's chit chat about it. But she snuck a lot of things past Candace too, because Candace isn't informed on the issues very closely. And I feel like Brianna is consciously choosing to present things in a very specific way for a very specific reason. But anyway, the question that you're posing is that cancel culture is subjective. Right? It's a case-by-case basis.
Oh, it is always. And that's one of the reasons why, like, working in the nuance of it, whether or not a private employer would actually, be fired for it is a way to actually make it make sense. Because, like, if you're basically saying that it was very funny watching some of the people try. There are still people out there who try to pretend cancel culture didn't even happen.
Yeah.
Isn't even real. Like Michael Hobbs has constantly embarrasses himself by talking about, hi, Michael. By talking about how this isn't real, it is a hoax, etc. And it's just kind of like, no, you've embarrassed yourself. It obviously happened. You can't gaslight the whole rest of the society who watched it happen.
Right.
So a lot of the book, Canceling the American Mind, I wrote it with the amazing, brilliant 23-year-old Ricky Schlott, and it came back out. It was unfortunate that it came out in October of last year because it got completely overshadowed by the horrifying things that were going on at the time.
Sorry about that.
But the three goals of it was, one, to show with data that cancel culture was real and it happening on a historical scale, and it really is unprecedented in a number of ways, particularly for the number of professors who have lost their jobs. Two, to get people to change their thinking about what cancel culture is, which is that it's not just targeting individuals to ruin their lives. It's part of a larger rhetorical strategy that allows you to defeat your opponents without persuading anybody, to just scare them out of the way and to rely on all these other cheap tactics to get out of an argument rather than actually have it. And then we spend a lot of the time trying to figure out like what potential solutions to cancel culture is. And probably the biggest meta point on this is like how much it destroys trust in expertise. Because I always give the example of Carol Hooven at Harvard. Carol Hooven, lovely woman, brilliant woman. She's an evolutionary biologist, and she had a book called Testosterone, Danger There. And she went on TV talking about her book, and she said that, like we should be compassionate towards trans people. We should bend over backwards to, be as accommodating as we can, but we can't pretend biological sex isn't real. And next thing you know, the DEI, the head of the DEI task force at Harvard was targeting her. Students wouldn't work her class. Harvard didn't issue a statement saying, no, we're not going to force someone out because they said biological sex is real. Only people like Jeff Flyer and Steve Pinker really stood up for her. And she eventually left Harvard. And I always have to point out, yes, that is very sad for Carol. Carol got really depressed for the first time in her life. She actually said that she had intrusive thoughts of suicide, which is unbelievable. Particularly, I mean, it's believable, but it's like knowing she's such a confident person. But I get it. I've been there myself. But the thing that Harvard doesn't get is that, no, what you just did is you devastated respect for Harvard, but more importantly, you devastated respect for expert opinion. Because if they know that even once someone lost their job for saying biological sex is real, they're never going to listen to you on this topic ever again. Looking at you, Scientific American, when you then actually turn around and actually try to say, oh, by the way, kind of like actually turns out biological sex exists on a spectrum. No, they're not going to listen to you after they know that the wrong opinion on this can mean your job.
The great irony on that is that the same people who say trust the experts, the ones who are most fans of cancel culture, in the sense that if there's dissenting views against the dogma of expertise, then we can't trust those opinions. Which is an interesting thing. They said the same thing, and based on what you said about pretending cancel culture didn't happen, you're seeing that with COVID too and policies now. Oh, we didn't really, we're trying to just quiet all that. But it's an interesting thing that those same people who politically align with trusting the science and not yourself or other people are the ones who are in favor of canceling those who have opinions they do not like or do not deem.
Okay, I have one last question for you. You mentioned when you were in Stanford, the First Amendment kids were not the cool kids.
Yeah.
However, what it may be like 30 years later, what's it been like to watch the thing that you've been passionate about your whole life become a mainstream, almost pop cultural topic of conversation?
Oh, I didn't think that's where you're headed with that. I thought you
what were
were
you
going to say, what has it been like to watch your greatest fears
Come true.
of what was going to happen all come true?
What I meant to ask is,
faster.
well, what's that?
Any publicity is good publicity, right? It is front and center. It maybe that's what you're. At least we know it's here.
Oh
because
no,
it's here.
I'd rather not have any publicity if it actually meant this wasn't true. Like I'd much rather, I always talk about like fire making itself obsolete, and I always tell my staff kind of like that's what we should hope for. We've solved the free speech problem. I go start up my comic book store. Kind of like we're all smart people. We'll all do cool things after that. And unfortunately, we're only this well known because things have gotten so much worse. And that is heartbreaking. But fire, we defend people all over the political spectrum. It would be so much easier for us to raise money if we didn't. Like basically, if we only defended people on the left or people on the right, then yeah, that's $100 million idea, within a couple of years. But we go the harder road, which is defending everybody because we want to be one of the institutions that all Americans can still trust. And I think people, and people who sometimes, like us because we come to the defense of someone on the left and then realize, oh, they defend people on the right, and vice versa, by the way. If they just want us to do that, we're going to be disappointing to them. So it's been rewarding to be working so long and so hard to create an organization that is so serious about this that right now everyone's looking at us for serious analysis in this, then that happened during all the encampments where normally, fire's stance is that's protected, that's protected, that's protected. Of course, with the encampments, a lot of that stuff, we're like, that's protected, that's not protected, that's protected, that should get you expelled, that's protected. But at this point, everyone knows they can come to us and we will be just frank and direct and call it like it is.
You've built up the credibility. Have you seen? Are you encouraged by the fact that we're seeing a bit of a reckoning here with DEI programs being closed, the Ibram X. Kendi being realized to be, oh boy, he didn't do much with all that money as far as at BU, and you're seeing a reckoning of like the worst ideas of the left have manifests, and everyone's like, oops.
Yeah.
There is a sense in the culture I'm picking up on. The bad thing is, like, Jordan Peterson predicted many, many years ago that with all of this intersectionality and wokeness, you will see a rise of the white identitarian right.
Yeah,
and
no
I'm
kidding.
seeing that, too, in the scariest way, especially on the, as I've been following the Israel issue, which is very close to us, you're seeing this weird wedge of on the conservative far-right faction, which I didn't see on the ascent until very recently.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is a collapse I'm picking up on of people saying, Me Too, cancel culture, DEI, like, I don't buy this anymore. Like, we need to go back to critical thinking. We need to go back to judging people as individuals. I kind of seeing people having more of a taste for that.
I'm seeing glimmers of hope here and there, but what you need is some meaningful, what I would call structural reform. You need better ways, better institutions, better fact-checking. You need... Because the reason why cancel culture, and the illiberalism that's happened in the last 10 years is such a big deal is that it's been worse at our knowledge-producing institutions. And now we're turning those knowledge and producing institutions, and we're making those, handing a lot of their findings over to AI, which is going to basically be objective truth from now on. And we really need something better than that, because so much of the scholarship, so much of the stuff that we've actually produced from our knowledge-producing institutions and journalism has had real issues with bias, partially because people are afraid to say what they really think, and there is groupthink and ideology rampant. So I think that yes, I'm heartened that there are some signs of improvement. We have a long way to go, more than that. And so hopefully you can help us at FIRE, continue to fight for free speech and academic freedom.
I know it's a semi-big topic, but I just would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. On ways to proper ways to deal with these challenges and improper ways. Your quick take on the anti-Semitism bill, because those of us speaking out against all these issues with protests and parsing those, splitting those hairs and parsing those nuances on what constitutes it. What's the problem with it? Should we legislate any of this? Should it just be one standard for all? What's your take on the problem?
The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act kind of breaks my heart because I've been very open about the fact that anti-Semitism is a major problem on elite campuses and particularly campuses in California for at least 10 years now. And I'm not Jewish. Like I've just seen it in the liberal circles that I'm in. Like I'm like, not yet. That essentially it's like, okay, I know you say you're anti-Israel, but I'll be damned if that didn't just sound like a gross Jewish stereotype that you were just engaging in. So I've seen enough with my own eyes. I don't need convincing. But our issue with the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, and this is the most important thing to say here, is we've been advocating for changing Title VI to include Jews. And as a way of actually, or to include religion in a way that would make it just as protected as it would be for Black people or for people of with any immutable characteristic. And if you did that and had in place the definition, that we call the Davis standard of harassment, you'd actually have something that was constitutionally bulletproof. We would have no issue with it whatsoever, and it would allow for the same kind of protections for Jewish students that Black students enjoy. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, the only reason why we object to the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is it incorporates the International Holocaust Remembrance Act definition of anti-Semitism, which was written by a guy named Ken. I can't remember his last name at the moment, but he's a friend of FIRE. He came up with this definition. Ken Stern. He's at Bard. He came up with this definition. He always made the point, this is an academic definition. It's not meant to be law. And the reason why it shouldn't be law is because it lists actual opinions about Israel, Israel's apartheid state, or some of these behaviors are similar to Germany in World War II. Like they list things that are kind of statements that would be assumed to be anti-Semitic. And it's like, no, that's a serious First Amendment issue. And here's the favor we're doing you. If you drop that part of the definition and you just take the simpler way to do it, you're also getting rid of the only constitutional infirmity. Because you keep the IHRA definition in there, there's a good chance that it gets challenged in court and you lose in court. And if you want to actually do something that actually helps Jewish students on campus, you better pass something that actually is constitutional. Right. So it's been frustrating because I feel like our point on this makes perfect sense. Even the author of the definition agrees with us. We don't oppose the idea that their anti-Semitism is a problem, or even changing the regulations so that Jewish students are better protected. But we do object to the inclusion of this one part that isn't helping anyway.
Right, and that will cause its downfall because now you're an academic understanding and legislating it, which is completely anti-free speech, as opposed to just standardizing everything across the board to include a group of people in a discriminatory,
now
anti-discrimination.
Of course, there are people who think that just passing the right rule will fix the problem, but then you still have the problem with the people actually enforcing the rules on campus are some of the same people who think that they're all part of a Zionist conspiracy,
right.
So like a lot of the ideological intersectional problems we see on campus, those are going to be the people enforcing this rule. So the idea that any new rule can, when campuses are so lost on some of these issues, will actually fix it, isn't realistic about how bad the environment often is on many of these campuses.
Well, I definitely appreciate that understanding of the problems with it because you see a lot of people with good intentions and their heart's in the right place and they just want this. But
sure.
If you incorporate the wrong ingredients, it will implode on itself and have really negative externalities, especially to the notions of these notions of Jews being conspiratorial, trying to control our speech. It's like no, we're trying to just have not a different standard than everyone else, just an equal standard.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's still work to be done. Greg Lukianoff, we appreciate you being here at Ami's house. A great conversation. Really enjoyed that. Thank you so much.
No, it was fun for me too. Take care.
Yes. Where can people find
Greg.
You quickly?
Thefire.org is my organization, and my Substack is called The Eternally Radical Idea.
Okay, great. And Marcuse, right? No. The Eternally Radical Idea. Greg Lukianoff, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for having me.